it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And we can do a couple of these right now while we're talking. It's a simple way to practice. And I tell clients, if you told me you wanted to run a marathon and you'd never run before, we wouldn't run 26.2 this weekend. We would train, and you'd start by walking short distances and work your way up. So one of the ways we can train willingness is to practice being deliberately uncomfortable. So even right now, people can do this as long as they're not driving. If you just fold your hands the way that feels comfortable and just notice how it feels, and now switch your fingers so you're just one off. And notice how it feels funny. You don't like it. You want to let go. You want to switch back. And can you notice and breathe and open and allow? And I teach people when I do my talks, I often do these kinds of willingness exercises with my audiences. And I do kind of a repeat after me mantra, which is, this is uncomfortable, but it's just a feeling. It is not dangerous. It is temporary, and I can handle it. And that is true. And that's not to invalidate that some feelings, if you're feeling panicky, that is very difficult, much more difficult than folding your hands, of course. And at the end of the day, it still really is just a feeling, and it's temporary, and it's not dangerous. And so if you can learn to relate to your feelings so that they're not enemies, they don't have to be your friends, but like where you're just learning to make space because feelings are just part of being a normal human being. And pain is not optional. Pain is part of the equation to being a normal human being, but you can learn how to respond when that shows up.
Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hey, Jill, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Today, we're going to talk about the ideas in your book, Imposter No More. And I want you to say we're going to talk about imposter syndrome, but I know that you don't like the word syndrome. You prefer to use words or phrases like imposter phenomenon or imposterism. For those who haven't read the book, tell me, why is this difference important?
Yeah, sure. So, when this phenomenon was first discovered in the late 70s, it was called the imposter phenomenon. And at that time, it was Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, two psychologists who believed that this was something that showed up only in high achieving women. And, so I find it quite interesting that something that was impacting high achieving women got rebranded culturally and socially as a syndrome, and a syndrome is a disorder, a disease, a pathology. And so I think, one issue with calling it imposter syndrome is that there is some sexism baked right into that idea. But the other is that when you look at research on the prevalence rates of these imposter thoughts and feelings, they vary pretty widely, but most studies find anywhere between 40 and 70%. So that means most of us have these thoughts and feelings at some point in our life. And in what other instance is there a disease, disorder, or pathology that affects most people? If it affects most people, it can't be a disease or a disorder or a pathology. It's just normal. So I think that's kind of the biggest reason. And then, of course, there is this research hasn't been done, but some people hypothesize that it may be more common among not just women, but anyone who has a history of marginalization. So in other words, if you've been told you don't belong at all the tables, a person of color doesn't belong at white tables or a woman doesn't belong at male tables, then it stands to reason you might be more likely to doubt and question whether you belong at those tables. And so, of course, we shouldn't pathologize an experience that may be born out of oppression.
Makes sense. Just to make sure that I understood, when you say 40-70, well, is there like 70% of people have an experience with these imposter feelings?
Exactly.
Okay.
In the studies that they do. So sometimes it's college populations, sometimes it's, medical students, sometimes it's people in tech. They've done these studies across a number of different samples. And I've seen the rates vary from 9% to 86%, but most of the studies find somewhere between 40 to 70% of people in their samples do experience the imposter phenomenon.
Understood. Jill, if you don't mind, before going live, you mentioned something about your own personal experience when you were a kid with your parents, the way they if I understood well, they called you. Would you mind sharing their story and how that has shaped your own experience when it comes to the imposter phenomenon?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was growing up, sometime in probably late elementary school, my mom especially, took to calling me Tubby, Little Tubbette, Tubby 2x4, who couldn't fit through the kitchen door. And, they were otherwise kind people, but in this particular domain, living in a fat phobic kind of society, they called me names. And so, of course, it really made me question am I lovable? Am I good enough? Am I adequate? It made me feel this just deep feeling of not being lovable or inadequate. And so that really led me to try to prove myself. And I'm sure there are listeners who can relate to this by people pleasing, by overachieving, because as long as I could get good grades and, get a few degrees and accumulate some successes and make people like me, then maybe I could prove that I was adequate or lovable. But of course, none of that really worked because it made me feel like I was only acceptable if I was people pleasing or achieving. And one of the things that made me the most interested in studying the imposter phenomenon isn't just that people experience it because, it's normal. That doesn't make it that interesting, but that over time, we don't outrun it. That studies show that it's actually a positive correlation, that the more you succeed, the more achievements or accomplishments you have, the more likely you are to experience these thoughts and feelings. And that just seemed totally counterintuitive to me, right? Like, shouldn't I be able to build up my portfolio and eventually get to a place where I'm like, okay, I'm confident now. I have done it. I have proven that I am good enough and worthy and whatnot. And that just doesn't seem to be the case, which is fascinating. And we can talk about why that is if you want, but where this sort of landed for me and how it's really transformed for me is the imposter thoughts and feelings showed up a number of times over the course of my life, but probably most profoundly when I had an opportunity to do a TEDx talk. And this was something that was bucket list. I want to do this at some point in my career, but I was planning to do it much later, once I built up the confidence and I felt like good enough and ready. And as things so often happen where timing is never as you want it to be, it happened during the pandemic. And, when you're called names and Tubby and a global pandemic hits, sometimes that means maybe coping with more food. And so I actually gained quite a lot of weight during COVID. And even though the psychologist in me knew that this shouldn't matter, the little girl in me that still had all of those very tender spots just felt like there was absolutely no way that I could do this. And where the imposter voice really showed up was, who do you think you are to teach anyone anything when you can't even get your own issues under control? And I just really did not think that I could do it. And what ended up happening is, luckily as a psychologist, I do a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. And the main goal of that is to build psychological flexibility. And we can talk about that if you want. And so essentially, I used the tools that I use with my clients and in my public speaking engagements on myself. And I ended up being able to do the talk. But what's important about this is I didn't wait until I felt confident. I didn't wait till I somehow magically erased my self-doubt and imposter thoughts and that voice saying, who do you think you are? And I didn't wait to lose weight. I did it in the presence of all of that fear. And I did it utterly terrified. And, since then I have lost 85 pounds. It's still very hard for me to watch that video. And I am so incredibly glad I did it and so proud of myself. And if I had avoided it, I would have avoided that fear and insecurity, but I also would have been left with a different kind of pain, a disappointment, a regret, right? And so I did it and had the pain, but then I also got to have a feeling of vitality and meaning and being proud of myself for being courageous and doing something that was really hard.
And we'll talk about some of the concepts that you mentioned already. Psychological flexibility included in your book. Also, as I told you before we started, there's a great idea that you share in your TEDx talk that I'd like to explore. Before we go there, though, there's another anecdote that you share. You say that for years, and I have it here, I've just summarized it here, you were convinced that the only reason you were accepted into a competitive grad school program was because your father knew the program director. So again, if you don't mind sharing that, how did that experience, if it did, shape your understanding of this phenomenon, the imposter phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, so this was I had applied to this program. I was convinced I wouldn't get in because it was very competitive. And I had been living out in California at the time. And my family, I'm from Massachusetts, and I didn't want to share it with my family because I didn't want the pressure. But eventually that guilt ate away at me. And I confessed that I applied to Boston University to work with Dr. Barlow. And my father, who's a businessman who knows absolutely nothing about mental health or psychology, says, "Oh, Dave Barlow, the psychologist?" And I was like, "Wait, what?" And it turned out they had played golf together at the same golf club. And he mentioned to Dave, "Oh, my kid's applying to your program." And, fast forward a handful of months, and I miraculously got in. And in my mind, I just thought, how could a mediocre applicant like me get into this program that only accepts, I think it was 1% to 2% of applicants at that time? And my brain said, well, obviously, it must be because your father knew the director. And, even as kind of going back to that idea that we don't outrun the imposter phenomenon, is even as I racked up a number of accomplishments, I still maybe it's still that little girl voice in me that's going, yeah, but probably the only reason you got in is because of your dad. And I think people feel this all the time if they're like a legacy at a university, anything where we can know intellectually that networking is good. And it's not a bad thing that if knowing someone helps you get a foot in the door, the rest is up to you. And intellectually, I understand that it's actually very offensive to assume Dave Barlow would give me entrance into his prestigious program if I wasn't going to succeed and be a positive reflection of that program. But what you intellectually know and what your fear tells you in your gut are often two very different things.
Why is it, you mentioned, and this is with your own experience, but also in general, you said that even if it's counterintuitive, but the more success you have, whatever that means for you, the more likely it is that you will experience those feelings.
Yeah.
What does that come from? Because yes, it is counterintuitive.
Right. I think it's a few things. I think partly it's what you are expected to know. Let's say you're a grad student or you're working in a mailroom or something. What you're expected to know is minimal. But as you rise up the ranks, if you're now, say, a full professor or you're the CEO, you're expected to know everything, or at least you tell yourself you're expected to know everything, even if you don't feel like the knowledge you have gained is commensurate with what is expected. And as you succeed, you kind of hear Oscar winners talk about this, that winning the Oscar didn't suddenly make them go, I've arrived. It made them go, oh, shoot, now I have something to prove. Now I have to live up to this award that I've been given. So, oh my gosh, if they've made me the CEO, they must think that I am incredible. I better make sure I prove that I'm incredible, even if I'm not totally sure that I deserve it. But I think where all of this comes from initially is evolutionary programming. So if you think about early humans hundreds of thousands of years ago, we didn't have, sharp fangs or sharp claws. We didn't run at high speeds. We had each other. And early humans who hunted and gathered and traveled together had a survival advantage. And if you got kicked out of your group, you were literally dead. And so having thoughts like, do I add value? Do I measure up? Do they believe that I deserve to be here? Because if they don't, I might die. So I better make sure that I'm pulling my weight and that everyone knows I'm pulling my weight. Now, fast forward to our modern times, we now know without a doubt that all the science has told us the most robust predictor of both our physical and mental health and well-being, our literal mortality and morbidity, what predicts that most strongly is the presence of quality relationships in our lives. So even today, do I add value? Do I measure up? Am I at risk of being ousted from this work group or social group, whatever group it is, still has deadly implications, even if it's not, getting killed by a tiger or something, And so that, that loss of connection is a real threat. And so us caring about proving ourselves around other people it's necessary. Like my book is not about trying to get rid of these thoughts and feelings, because I don't think we can. But even if we could, I'm not so sure we should.
Yeah, and that's the key takeaway from your book. You say that there's no cure, that there's an alternative. But what you said is super interesting, because so on the one hand, you said that the science tells us that the number one predictor for mental health and like health in general is quality relationships. On the other, I'm thinking, okay, I understand what you're saying, but then because of that often makes us do something or live in a way that makes it hard for us to have and experience these quality relationships, if you know what I mean.
I know 100% what you mean. And that is exactly what cultivating psychological flexibility is all about. It's recognizing that when these thoughts and feelings show up, the self-doubt, the anxiety, the fear, they are designed to protect us. Like those thoughts are designed to protect you from failure, humiliation, rejection. And the belief is like, if I go, like the TED Talk example, if I go do this, it's going to just be a total bomb. And then I'll be out in the world alone. So I better not do it to protect myself. But then you're sacrificing, there's many opportunity costs to listening to that. And what is, I don't know if I can say 100%, but I've yet to find an example where this isn't the case. But our avoidance strategy. So I would define avoidance as anything that you do or don't do to try to control how you feel, like to reduce your anxiety or to prevent a feared outcome from happening. All of our avoidance strategies, they have a function in the short term. They give us relief. They make us feel safe and protected and better. But they typically have a cost. And often that cost is creating the exact outcome we're trying to avoid. So for example, if someone with OCD is washing their hands a lot, you're actually breaking down that protective barrier that makes you more susceptible to infection. If you're, say, like a jealous spouse and you're afraid that your partner is going to abandon you or cheat on you, and so you start reassurance seeking and checking their email and checking to make sure their car is in the parking lot at the place they said they were going to be. Those behaviors make you feel better in the moment, but they're exactly the thing that is going to lead to the demise of the relationship. And we could come up with 1,000 other examples where that's the case. And so the key to that psychological flexibility is, can I change my relationship to these thoughts and feelings? Can I know that they're there to try to help me, but they might be like the threat, like they might be set too high. Like, when the wind blows and a car alarm goes off, that's how our bodies are kind of functioning. We can like turn down the dial there and instead really let our values guide what we choose to do or not do. And so for me, doing that TED Talk, it was, even in the presence of those really painful thoughts and feelings, can I choose to show up and do this thing because it deeply matters to me? Sharing this message with others is important to me. And can I be willing to take that quote unquote risk, even in the presence of fear?
Okay, so far, we've learned that when we think about the imposter phenomenon, that there's no cure. You talk about an alternative. You say that the goal is not to eliminate those feelings, but to manage them. You told us that and I'm trying to paraphrase here, please correct me if I'm explaining it incorrectly, but the alternative is this concept of psychological flexibility. Now, are there any practical tips that you can give us for us to be able to cultivate psychological flexibility, also to be able to, for example, choose bold career moves, or maybe do like bold things like doing that TED talk despite of what you were feeling, despite self-doubt, despite imposterism?
Yes, absolutely. So really there's kind of three main elements. One is identifying your values in the first place. And all that is, I like to say, it's the me you want to be. It's, so by definition, psychological flexibility is our ability to be in this present moment, because it's the only one there is, the one that's happening right now.
I'm reading, sorry, Julie, to interrupt, because you mentioned this. At the moment, I'm reading The Power of Now. I don't know if you know the book. It's an
Yes, yeah,
talks
right.
about the present moment, yeah.
That's all you got is right this second. The last one's already gone and the next one hasn't happened yet. So in this moment, can I be aware of and open to all my internal experiences, thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, urges, all of it, fully and without defense. So I'm allowing them to be here in whatever form they're here without doing anything to try to push it away or control it. And make conscious, deliberate choices, so not on autopilot, to choose values, to show up as the me I want to be, to do what matters to me. So that's psychological flexibility. So first it's, let's figure out our why. What are our values? Who do I want to be in this world? And so like with the TED Talk, I wanted to be brave and courageous and not hide because I was feeling insecure. And so really values are like, it's partly what you do, but really it's the qualities you embody as you do it. Because let's say you decide you want to start doing like a Sunday dinner and game night with your family because your family is important to you and you want to really like be a family man, If the whole time you're there, you're scrolling your phone, that's not really value. So yes, doing the Sunday dinner game night is part of the equation, but how do you want to show up? Do you want to be present, playful, loving, affectionate, a good listener? So it's really, it's the qualities you embody. So those are your values. And then it's like, okay, but what's getting in the way of that? What do I notice when I go pick up my phone to scroll instead of being present with my partner or my kids? Oh, it's an urge, or it's boredom, or it's, that kind of thing. So the next step is when I recognize what these obstacles to valued living might be, I need to do something differently. So those thoughts and feelings are no longer obstacles. And so with feelings, it's really about willingness, or the easiest way to remember this is it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And we can do a couple of these right now while we're talking. It's a simple way to practice. And I tell clients, if you told me you wanted to run a marathon and you'd never run before, we wouldn't run 26.2 this weekend. We would train, and you'd start by walking short distances and work your way up. So one of the ways we can train willingness is to practice being deliberately uncomfortable. So even right now, people can do this as long as they're not driving. If you just fold your hands the way that feels comfortable and just notice how it feels. And now switch your fingers so you're just one off. And notice how it feels funny. You don't like it. You want to let go. You want to switch back. And can you notice and breathe and open and allow? And I teach people when I do my talks, I often do these kinds of willingness exercises with my audiences. And I do kind of a repeat after me mantra, which is, this is uncomfortable, but it's just a feeling. It is not dangerous. It is temporary, and I can handle it. And that is true. And that's not to invalidate that some feelings, if you're feeling panicky, that is very difficult, much more difficult than folding your hands, of course. And at the end of the day, it still really is just a feeling and it's temporary and it's not dangerous. And so if you can learn to relate to your feelings so that they're not enemies, they don't have to be your friends, but like where you're just learning to make space because feelings are just part of being a normal human being. And, pain is not optional. Pain is part of the equation to being a normal human being, but you can learn how to respond when that shows up. And there are endless ways that people can practice this. And then it's also changing your relationship to your thoughts, which is really about thinking, really going, okay, if I listen to this thought, is that going to move me in the direction of my values, the me I want to be, or move me away? If your thoughts are saying, you didn't do a great job showing up with your kids at that Sunday night dinner. You were kind of sucked into your phone, and that's not really consistent with the kind of dad or partner or whatever it is you want to be. That's probably a thought you want to listen to because it's telling you you're acting inconsistently with your values. But if it's saying, you know what, you're such a bad parent, you should just abandon your family and move to Aruba because they're better off without you, that's probably not going to be a helpful thought that's going to move you in the direction of your values. And so then there are lots of different ways to kind of learn to step back and observe, notice the thoughts, not respond on autopilot as if they're truths with a capital T, and sort of get choosy about when and whether to listen when they show up.
This idea of learning to be comfortable, being uncomfortable is so relevant and useful for those listening to this podcast. The theme of this podcast is for business leaders who want to communicate more effectively. It's for those who want to improve their presentation skills. You were talking about TED and public speaking. For example, Jill, this morning I received an email from someone who attended a presentation skills workshop that I ran a few months ago. And he said, it was great. I took away lots of insights. I gave this presentation recently in front of 100 people. It went well. I was prepared. But as I was doing it, I was feeling very nervous. Do you have any tips for me? And my answer was, of course, there are practical things we can do, like, for example, drinking water and moving before the presentation and deep breathing and engaging with the audience early on to shift the focus away from you and to the audience. There are so many practical things that can be done, and they will help a little bit, but none of these things will help until you get to a point where you realize, whether we like it or not, that, for example, speaking in public is not a comfortable thing to do. And that's it. And so we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. You do it once and it will be tough. You do it a couple of times, it may be a bit better. You do it 10 times, 100 times, do it 1,000 times. The journey to becoming a more confident presenter, for example, I think is a journey of 1,000 presentations. And it's very much connected to this idea of learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
100%. I love that. And I do think it is, I get sad whenever I see all of these, 10 tips for building your confidence for speaking or whatever else. And then I think people, not only do they feel scared to present, then they feel like failures, that they can't control their anxiety. And the way I look at it is this: if you think about the last time you were laying awake at 2 a.m., we've all had that experience. The wheels are spinning. We can't fall back to sleep. What is it that you were spinning over? And I always joke, about this in my talks too, is it probably isn't that Game of Thrones isn't coming back for another season, even if it was your favorite show of all time. You worry about the people you love being competent at work, your health, the state of the world. You worry about the things you care about. And, I also tell the story that you know how they say it's just like riding a bike, to mean you can get back to doing something even if you haven't done it in a long time and you don't need to practice. It'll be automatic. Well, I hadn't ridden a bike in 10 years and I got back on my bike and I started to ride and I immediately crashed. So for me, riding a bike was actually not just like riding a bike. But do you know how much time I spent worrying about crashing on that bicycle? 0 seconds. 0. Because I don't care about my ability to pedal a two-wheeled machine. But it triggered all these thoughts about how my kids at the time, I think, were 8 and 10, and they still didn't know how to ride a bike. And it was, oh my God, you're a terrible mother. All the other kids in the neighborhood knew how to ride bikes by the time they were 4 or 5. How could you let this happen? And so what's the difference? The difference is I care deeply about being a good mom and about my children's well-being. And if you look to don't believe me because I'm some psychologist expert person on this, look to your own experience. If you look to the places where you feel anxiety or fear or discomfort, whatever it is going to be because it matters. So whenever someone is getting up to do a presentation, you probably want to do a good job. You probably care about making a difference in the life of your audience, that they're getting something of value. You care about kind of performing in a competent way. And so it would be utterly ridiculous to expect to have perfect confidence and zero fear in that situation. Yes, we habituate. If you do it 1,000 times, it will get easier over time because you're learning that what your mind is telling you is going to happen. I'll be boring. It'll be a disaster. They'll hate me. Everybody will fall asleep. With experience, you learn that those outcomes almost never come true, or even if they do, they're not as bad as you think and you can handle it. And so that repetition creates new learning where you evaluate the situation as quote unquote less dangerous, less socially dangerous. But you will probably still, I've given, hundreds, dozens, many talks, and I get super nervous every single time because I desperately want to do a great job and deliver what my audience wants me to deliver. So of course it's uncomfortable, and that's okay as long as you show up and you do your job.
Before we continue with this episode, I just want to share a few resources that I think will be super useful for you. The first one is check out either my book, Confident Presenter, or my colleague Phil Wakenall's book, Business Presentation Revolution, or both. These are books for business owners and leaders who want to take their presentation skills to a higher level. To make the most of the books, take the Confident Presenter Scorecard, which is an online tool that allows you to assess your presentation skills for free in less than 3 minutes. And then also, at the moment, I'm running a series of free presentation skills web classes, and I'd love to see you there. The links are in the show notes. Now let's go back to the episode. Despite, Jill, I'm a presentation coach. I always feel nervous before presenting, but so it's not about, the aim should not be to overcome the nerves. We want to, again, get to a point where we accept the fact that we learn how to be comfortable with that, being uncomfortable. And you mentioned your TEDx talk a few times already, how to succeed even when you're failing. And there's a concept in your talk which resonated with me so much. You talk about the idea of holding holding outcomes lightly. Again, for those who haven't watched, and I'm going to include in the show notes, for those who haven't watched it, what do you mean by holding outcomes lightly?
Yeah. So essentially, it's this idea that, at least in Western cultures, we're taught that success is about achieving some specific goal. But often goals are outcomes that we don't entirely control. So, for example, I think the example I give in the TED Talk is, as a writer, someone who's published several books, I guess, I don't use this exact example, but I'll give this example now. It's of course, my goal would be for my imposter book to become a New York Times bestseller. I can write the best book on the planet. I can have a, Big 5 New York publisher. I can have a great agent. You can have all the right things. And whether that outcome happens or not is based on a lot of different factors that are not under your control. And so then would we say, oh, well, okay, I didn't achieve my goal, so I guess I'm a failure. And yes, that's often what we do. We feel so disappointed and like we really have screwed up in some way. And I do this exercise. Can we do it? It's pretty quick. We can do it on the podcast. Yeah. Okay. So I do it with lots of my clients. It is if you find something you can hold in your hand, like a pen or a chapstick, it doesn't have to write, just something you can hold in your hand, your phone, you could use your phone, right? Anything you're able to squeeze. And think of some goal that you've been trying to achieve that has kind of eluded you. And it can be work related. It can be getting a number of followers online. It can be finding a spouse, anything. and something that you've been putting a lot of energy or effort into that just you haven't quite gotten there. And I want you to squeeze whatever this object is as hard as represents all the efforting you've been putting in, everything you've been doing, all the time you're spending thinking about it, and give it a number 0 to 10 in your head and notice how it feels. And then let go about 50%. So if you were at an 8, hold it at a 4 and notice how that feels. And then hold it as lightly as you can without dropping it and notice how that feels. And what's the one thing that hasn't changed? You're still holding the object. Exactly. Yep. You're still holding the object. And so what this is meant to represent metaphorically is holding that object is doing the things you can control doing. Taking the steps to make it, there's nothing wrong with having goals, of course. And you want to take all the steps that make achieving those goals more likely, but while you're holding the outcome more lightly, and that you keep your why close by, and that's your values. So for me, before publishing my professional books, I was doing a lot of creative writing. And I wrote for 10 years and didn't, of course, the goal was to publish, never published anything. And listeners might be like, well, maybe you're just bad at it and you should have given up. But for me, it wasn't about that outcome. It was about creativity, skill building, learning, right? Those are those qualities that I wanted to embody, those values. And when you're clear on those values, it creates perseverance and persistence. And I finally published my first personal essay in year 11 of writing. And it's an essay that has had an impact on people who have been like suffering and struggling in a particular way. And so that's the idea, is if we can really persist in something because it matters to us while continuing to try to improve and get the goals that we want, but really holding the outcome lightly because we often just don't control it.
Yep. Yeah. And again, it resonated with me. I watched your TEDx talk at beginning of January. So I was doing my yearly review for the business, and with that business, we've been running it for many years now, and we've achieved great things, great milestones. But there's always, at least that's how my mind works, there's always something else, a bigger outcome, and I'm doing a lot of personal reflections on these things. That's why, for example, I'm reading The Power of Now.
Yeah.
And that message that you shared in your talk it felt like it gave me permission to just also accept that, of course, we could have done, there's always an opportunity to do better, to do more, but also say, you know what, it's been great. The outcome was good. The journey was great, which is perhaps even more important than the outcome. And I liked the fact that for you don't say the outcome doesn't matter. You should not have bold goals. No, you should. That's fine. Yeah. But then we can work towards these outcomes and these goals to make it more likely that they will happen, but holding them lightly at the same time.
Yeah.
So it relieves a lot of weight for me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And creates more of that ability to persist.
Yep.
And I think it's important too to realize how, it's exactly what you were saying when you were looking over your year and your goals, et cetera, is how we always tend to compare up. We always look at how it could be bigger and better and the people who are more successful than we are, and don't tend to compare down and go, wow, I'm really killing it compared to where I used to be or where many of these other people are. And I think that's one of those evolutionary things too, is like, this is the way that our brains try to really keep us on our toes and prevent us from failing. But it's important to sort of broaden that field of vision and not lose sight of the ways in which we might be kicking butt, even if, yes, of course, it could always be bigger and better. And,
but that's so true. Like, for example, thinking about like very practical things, I can share that. That's fine. Like, our company revenues, like not the actual numbers, but if I think about, you were talking about the pandemic, 2020. If I think about the business performance in 2020. And in 2020, at the end of it, I was very happy because despite everything, we did well. Now, last year, it was almost double that in terms of performance. So very good, but you're right. I was not thinking, a few days ago when I was doing the review, I was not thinking, oh, in 2020, that's what we did. I was thinking, no, I was looking at the future, what we could have done.
Right. Yes, exactly. And that's what brains do, to try to make sure that you're going to keep on grinding so you do better next year. And just remembering that car alarm is like, is the car alarm going off when the wind is blowing? Like, am I maybe responding to this negative voice in a way that it's not, quite as an emergency as my brain maybe likes to think that it is.
Yeah. And what about leaders within organizations and organizations themselves? What role do they play, leaders, organizations, in shaping and creating cultures and environments that allow people to show and to be vulnerable and to show that vulnerability and self-compassion?
That is a great question. And, there are some people out there that give these big graduation speeches and these other things saying, stop telling us that we have imposter syndrome. This is a systemic issue. And that is true. The thing that I said at the beginning of the show is, this can be a way to kind of keep marginalized people small. And yes, the system needs to be fixed. But I also think that if we sit around waiting for systems to be fixed, we'll be waiting a long time and then we're suffering all the while. And so this is a both and issue. We need to talk about systems and organizations and individuals. And I think one of the most powerful ways that leaders who impact the system and the individual can have an impact is through modeling. We know that this gets worse as people succeed, and that most of us experience it. But because we're so afraid of being, quote unquote, found out, we don't talk about it very openly. Because if I admit that I'm afraid that I'm going to be outed as a fraud, then aren't I outing myself as a fraud? So I think if leaders can take that step to say, oh my gosh, I feel this way all the time. Or I used to feel this way, or I feel this way in this context, but not this context. It's normal. It's fine. Let's talk about, what are your goals and how can I support you? And let's get you moving in these directions, even when that voice is loud. Like, let's work together to kind of combat these very normal thoughts and feelings so that we can all be as successful as we want to be and be doing the things that we want to do. I think the other thing that's important to talk about that doesn't get as much attention is, the obvious way imposter thoughts and feelings affect us is that we avoid opportunity. Oh, I'm not good enough, right? Who do I think I am to give a TED Talk when I can't even get my own issues under control, so I don't do the TED Talk? But probably just as common, if not more so, is the other thing that these thoughts and feelings drive us to do is get on a hamster wheel of achievement. If I just get one more award, one more promotion, one more, then maybe I'll finally feel good enough and confident enough. And so what is the risk of that? The first example I gave, the risk is obviously missed opportunity. But the risk of this hamster wheel is burnout. And burnout has really serious, long-lasting consequences if you get to that point. And so where psychological flexibility comes in is right in the middle of those two extremes, to get clear on where do I want to be spending my time, my effort, my energy that matters to me, and really giving that my all, not overdoing it to try to outrun my imposter thoughts and feelings, but not underdoing it out of fear. And I think that's another conversation that leaders can have with one another and with their teams is what does that look like for you so that you're neither missing opportunities nor, getting to burnout. Because you might think it's great if you have overachievers on your team, but not if they end up burnt out. That's not going to be good for anybody in the long run.
Yeah. We're talking about modeling, and you made me think of what you shared at the very beginning of this conversation, which is that up to, on average, 70% of even high achievers experience these imposter feelings. And even that stat makes me feel not alone. Because, of course,
yes, exactly. Yeah. Yep, exactly. I led this panel discussion. It's actually where this whole journey to writing this book and everything started. Is I did a panel discussion at a conference about the whole imposter experience. And it was 5 very successful women who got up and, shared their experiences. And my hope was that everyone in the audience would go, wait, what? You too? But you're the president of the organization, but you went to Harvard, but you did, right? And that if they see all these successful people who say, I suffer deeply with these, painful thoughts and feelings too, that they would say, wait, well, if you can do it, so can I. And that's exactly what happened. We got so much feedback from people coming up saying, I cannot believe that you have these thoughts and feelings too. I thought it was just me. Yep. And I tell the story, I think I tell it in the book, about one of my friends who's like a healthcare CEO badass. And I was interviewing her for the book, and she very earnestly said to me, but Jill, how do you know if you have imposter syndrome or if you're really an imposter? And I was like, oh, honey, like if that just doesn't speak to what this experience is all about, like, oh, this isn't an imposter phenomenon. This is because I really am a fraud, and any minute people are going to figure it out like that. Well, that's how you know.
Yeah. It speaks for itself. And Jill, if someone listening today feels overwhelmed by, and of course, this is not a therapy session, but if someone feels overwhelmed by these thoughts and feelings. And by the way, it could be that this question makes no sense at all, because maybe there is no one thing. I'm sure that there is no one thing that fixes everything. But is there something small, perhaps practical, that it's not that it will solve everything, but something that will help them feel more empowered? So perhaps it is more a practical action they can do right now.
Well, I'll tell you how I did this TED Talk. And it was basically, I had a client who came to session, and she had done all these brave things. And I said, what was the secret? How were you able to do this if you were feeling overwhelmed by these thoughts and feelings? And she said, well, anytime I had a hard choice, I just thought WWJD, which of course normally means what would Jesus do? And as I start to spiral internally, oh my gosh, she's religious. How did I not know this? I'm the worst therapist. She says, what would Jill do? And she just thought, like she said, I kind of carried you on my shoulder. And I just thought if Jill were here, what would she tell me to do? Or what would she do? And I loved this. So when I had, fast forward to 2020 with this TED Talk, when she had come up with that strategy, I thought, well, who would my J be? And my J is Oprah. And the reason Oprah is my person is because she's overcome, she has been through abuse, sexism, poverty, racism, fat shaming, which of course was relevant for me with this TED Talk. And so when I had the opportunity to do the TED Talk, I thought, well, what would Oprah do? And then my next thought was, shit. Because of course, Oprah would do the talk, and she would do it at any size, because she shows up and she perseveres, and at least as far as I know, shows up authentically and does what matters to her, regardless of anything else. And that's how I wanted to be. I want to be brave and authentic. And I took this a step further. And I thought, well, if Oprah knew I were suffering in this way, what might she say to me? And I could hear her voice saying, Jill, you are so much more than your body. And if you have a message to share that helps even one person, that is your professional mission. You can do this. You must do this. And so that's what listeners can do. Pick your O. And your O can be someone you know, like a coach, a grandparent. It can be someone you feel like you know, like a celebrity, like Oprah. Or it can even be a fictional character. I have lots of people pick like Harry Potter characters of all things. And just think about if this person were in a similar challenging situation with all this self-doubt, these imposter thoughts and feelings, what would they do in a similar situation? And what might they encourage you to do if they knew that you were struggling in this way? And it seems very simple, but it is truly what made me say yes to that talk.
Love it. Talking about Oprah, the reason why I'm reading The Power of Now at the moment is because Oprah recommends it. So when I read the description of the book, to me, it seems a bit like too much spiritual. Like the author is a spiritual teacher. I'm not super spiritual in my life, so I was a bit conflicted. But then I saw that she recommends it. I was like, okay, let's give it a try. If she recommends it, I'll give it a try. And okay, by the way, talking about books, beyond your own book that I recommend, and again, we're going to include in the show notes, Imposter No More, highly recommended for everyone. If you think about what we talked about today, it could be strictly related to the imposter phenomenon or maybe like similar topics. Do you have any book recommendations for our listeners?
I do. I just read an amazing book. It's called Likeable Badass by Allison Fergale. And it's all about what Likeable Badass means is she's a researcher, and it shows that like basically the way to get the success you deserve is by learning how to combine both warmth and assertiveness together in your kind of professional endeavors. And it's really well written. It's all science-based, but very accessible in terms of being easy to read. I just interviewed her for my podcast, which is called Psychologists Off the Clock. So that won't come out for a little while, but she was lovely and so smart. And I just love all of the concepts. I learned so much in terms of like actual takeaways that you can start implementing right away. Simple little things like getting other people to recommend you, but they need to know who you are. So put a picture of yourself in your email signature, which I did immediately and took me 30 seconds. So, there's lots of great tips like that you can implement straight away.
Mentioned assertiveness, very much relevant to this podcast. So Jill, I may need an introduction to her.
Happy to. I'm sure she would come on.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely.
And if people want to say hi, learn more about your work, connect with you, where do they find you? Where should they go?
Yes. So the best way to find me with all the books and the podcasts and everything is just jillstoddard.com. If anyone wants to hire me to do any speaking, my signature keynote is all that we've been talking about. It's called Do It Scared. And it's about challenging outdated and misleading ideas about confidence and success, right? That you can be successful without needing to feel confident, just like we've been talking about. And so I have a full speaker website that's thewellbeingspeakers.com.
Perfect. And I'm going to include everything in the show notes. Let's close with this, Jill. Have I forgot anything? Again, if you think about everything we've talked about, the imposter phenomenon, psychological flexibility, being comfortable with something which is uncomfortable, like so many things. Is there a question I should have asked that I didn't ask? Have I missed something?
I don't think you've missed anything, but I'd love to end on my favorite metaphor that I created that I think really nicely sums up a lot of what we've talked about. Does that work?
Let's do it.
Okay.
So, by the way, I love metaphors, analogies. So that's a great way to end the conversation.
And it's a great way to learn. That's my first book. It's a metaphors book for therapists who do acceptance and commitment therapy. So this is one I created that I think it works so well to tie together everything we've talked about today. And so the idea is that you imagine that you're a ship and you are journeying in the sea, in the ocean, on a grand adventure, when all of a sudden a very thick fog rolls in. And of course, this fog is your thoughts and your feelings, your self-doubt, your fear, your anxiety. And it's so thick you can't even see your hand in front of your face. And you think my only option is to drop anchor because it's not safe to continue journeying. And so you drop anchor and you figure you'll wait it out. You'll wait for the fog to clear. But what if the fog doesn't clear? Has yours? Mine hasn't. My fog is always present in some way. And so as long as we are anchored, we're stagnant. We're no longer moving forward in the directions that matter to us. No more adventure, no more journey. And so what if there was a way to journey forward even in the presence of the fog? And that's the lighthouse. So that lighthouse is your beacon of light that can guide you even when the fog is thick. And the lighthouse, of course, is your values. It's who you want to be, what you want to stand for, that me you want to be. And so that's it. So that's the way to kind of wrap all that together is let your values be your guide, even in the presence of those thick and pesky thoughts and feelings that threaten to get you off course and keep you stagnant.
This is great, Jill. And also, again, for our listeners who are interested in all things communication, it's very much connected to what we said earlier. For example, in preparation for a speaking engagement, the fog will be there, and that's right. Your fear, your nerves. The objective, the goal should not be to eliminate the fog, because most likely it will not happen. It will never happen. But we can learn to deal with it and
exactly
to navigate the ship, or to just give that talk, for example, as you've done with your TEDx talk. Jill, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, even more for sharing your insights, and let's keep in touch. All the very
best. You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a great conversation.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com, or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.